Hi, all. Welcome back to another episode of RunYogi Diaries. This is your host, Santosh Shiva. In today's episode, we dwell into something that's intriguing, fascinating, and is on everybody's mind, which is what is the brain function and how does it relate to our daily life? How does it relate to our choices, our happiness, all of it? The world of brain is a world of neuroscience. And for that, I have with me Shrinath Kadamangudi, who is a neuroscientist that will give us an insight on what's behind it all. On part two of this episode, we dwell into a little bit of the woo-woo, which is the intersection of the physical with the metaphysical, and how does neuroscience see things like consciousness, spirituality. Is there more to us than just our brain? And for that, you'll have to wait and check out this episode 2. But for now, let's dig in and get the episode 1 started, learn a little bit about the brain itself. If you like what I do in this channel, please remember to hit subscribe, like the video if you like what we talk, and feel free to share if you like this content and if you think that makes a difference with others. This episode is also available on all major podcast platforms if audio is your thing. Let's dig in. Hi Shri, welcome to RunYogi Diaries.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. I've known you for so long, like what, 20 years, 20 plus years, and fascinated with what you're doing, and want to have a conversation around neuroscience. So I thought you'd be the perfect person to talk to. So I have your resume here, so I want to do a quick introduction of why I thought you would be a great person to talk to.
Sure.
So first off, because I know you for so long, just kidding. But most importantly, you have been studying neuroscience for like almost 8 years now, since the time you
Yep.
graduated high school.
Yep.
You have a bachelor's in neuroscience from UT Dallas. You did an MPhil in neuroscience from Australia. And now you're in a dual MD PhD program in UT Texas in medical branch Galveston, where you're again planning to do or are doing a PhD in neuroscience
That's correct.
in the area of exploring therapeutic strategies for Alzheimer's and age-related dementias. Um, what's also fascinating is that you're also a spiritual seeker. So you're exploring the intersection of brain science and metaphysics. So we
Right.
will get into that a little bit as well. But more than anything else, what we really want to spend some time today, Shri, is to bring some awareness about neuroscience. How what does brain do for us, and how it kind of impacts our day-to-day life. So my audience would love to take a few learnings and understand how their actions and how brain behaves interact.
Sure.
But before we do all that, let me maybe start with your journey. Flashback a little bit and see, why did you even get into neuroscience? What got you fascinated?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ever since I was a kid, I've always been fascinated about the way the brain works, and you're really trying to understand what makes us who we are. I guess we could just start by saying I was generally good at science. I kind of sucked at math and other subjects anyways. But, I remember myself, as far as I can remember, writing my own name, wondering what is this name? Like, who am I? Like, what are we doing here? That kind of thing. And I guess through middle school and high school, I kind of felt a little bit of a loner because I don't think my peers really, saw eye to eye in that kind of question. But I guess destiny would have it that I, got into the program at UT Dallas. I know my dad had high hopes for me going to Harvard and all those kinds of institutes, but honestly, it just kind of clicked, and was really fortunate to get into that program. But prior to that, actually, in high school, that was when my great grandmother two of my great grandparents actually were diagnosed with neuro-related illnesses. One with dementia, and the other one with Alzheimer's disease. And that definitely changed my perspective of how, I saw personality and what makes us who we are, because that was an illness not just like of medical origin, but it completely transformed who they were, changed their ability to think and interact with everybody else around them. So then I kind of entered into college aiming to study the brain, its substrates, and who we are. And really one thing led to another after that. And it's been kind of a pretty linear journey. It didn't feel like it at the time, but, bachelor's to master's, took a little bit of time off, worked, did some self-exploration in the middle there, then decided, maybe let's give this medical school thing a shot. And so here we are.
Nice. That's awesome. It's always useful to have a underlying purpose that drives your choice, versus just being doing it for money, or purely materialistic, just to survive. So I think that's wonderful. So maybe we should start from some basics, right?
Sure.
And get into a bit of neuroscience 101. So maybe start with what is neuroscience versus maybe psychiatry. And there are different science of studies today. And what is neuroscience to start
Absolutely.
with?
Yeah. So neuroscience is a study, very broadly, it's just a study of the brain and the nervous system. And so many people think it's just the brain, but really, I think it's more accurate to say the nervous system, because we have what's called a central nervous system and a peripheral nervous system, where a central nervous system encapsulates the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, is responsible for all our sensors and movement and whatnot, right? Also, I want to quickly mention that there's also neurology, which is the practice, the clinical applications of what is derived from neuroscience research. So a little bit more translational. When people come in with everything from sensory motor disorders, or let's say from birth, like neurodevelopmental disorders, sensory motor disorders, cognitive issues, those kinds of things. And then a lot of people always get confused between psychiatry and psychology and neurology. So psychiatry, I'll kind of start with the difference between psychiatry and psychology. Both of them are really the clinical applications or interventions for the more abstract piece of the human mind. Whereas neurology is a little bit more, I almost compare it to people like, once we understand the neural basis of psychiatric issues well enough, it gets converted into a neurological thing, which is kind of funny. We actually started back in the day by looking at mind and brain problems as one, and then it kind of diverged. And I think we're actually re-emerging and understanding that they're actually both very interrelated. But currently, as it stands, psychiatry is the sort of medical interventions to more abstract problems of the mind, and most importantly, that involve medications. Psychology is a little bit more of a sort of academic approach to the mind, but also definitely there's lots of interventions, therapeutic interventions there, where people can gain therapeutic strategies through therapy, and really it's working through their problems from a very personal level that does not involve medications. So just to summarize, we have neuroscience, neurology, psychiatry, and psychology, where really the medication part of it's through neurology and psychiatry, and the other two are a little bit more academic, more personal.
Yeah, and I guess if I were to just kind of see this from a layman's perspective, if you look at it from a layer point of view, you have a substrate, which is the organic physical substrate, the brain, and then there is the there is a programming on top, right?
Right.
Just like a computer, right?
Right.
In the computer, you have a silicon substrate. We are a organic substrate, and then you have all the programming on top, which is all the patterns and memories,
Absolutely.
and that's all the mind and psychology aspect of it.
Yep. Absolutely on target.
right?
Yeah,
From a
so I'll go ahead
simple.
and I'll go ahead and explain that a little bit in the sense that so what exactly you're kind of referring to there.
Mhm.
It's a concept that we refer to as mapping, which is
Mm.
essentially what the brain serves as. It's a physical substrate onto which information is mapped. So I think is like there's just opportunity to just provide some like fun facts about the brain that allow us to understand this. And the funny thing is that the brain is it's just a 3 pound object of just a 3 pound object. It's just mush.
Mm.
I was in the cadaver lab and you remove the brain and you're like, it's actually surprisingly underwhelming. You're like, what is this thing? You dissect the muscles and the heart and you're like, see these beautiful striations and whatever. But the brain is just like this thing. It's like what's so fascinating about it?
Mm.
But since the advent of neuroscience research, since we've been able to study it at various levels, we're able to study at the organ level, the anatomical level, organ level, tissue level, cell level,
Mm.
RNA, DNA. So we're breaking it down layer by layer in spatial and temporal scales. We've gotten some really, really amazing insights.
Mm.
And so basically, I want to introduce the topic by saying that the brain basically is composed of what we call neural tissue. And so this neural tissue is composed of cells, and there's two primary categories of cells. One's the neurons, and the other one's that's that I talked about a lot is the glia. For example, the glia are actually very important. When they actually looked at Einstein's brain, they found no difference in actually the number of neurons or the quality or character of neurons, but rather it was the type of glia that he had and the number of
Mm.
those glia. So glia are actually supporting cells. They seem to support the function and the health of neurons. There's various different types. Don't need to go into it right now, but they basically are supporting cells. So it's like, okay, there's these things called neurons. What do they do? How much are they? So there's actually, estimated about close to about 80 to 100 billion neurons in the human brain. So this
Mm.
is 3 pound ball of mush. There's this 100 billion units, if you will, of
Mhm.
things that they act like nodes that send information to one another.
Mhm.
But what's amazing is that even if that were the case, how do you pack so much information or how do you layer so much information upon these nodes? Because there is still
Mm.
a limit, a physical limit, if you will. And this is where it gets really cool, where information is not stored just in space in terms of the raw number of neuronal connections, but also in time, the frequency at
Mm.
which they talk to each other.
Mm.
So, um, so I think I jumped there a little bit, but you have these 100 billion neurons, but the way they're connected to each other is by these things called synapses. That's actually
Mm.
the focus a lot of my research currently right now. And synapses is just a connection between two neurons. We actually have close to, 1 quadrillion estimated one quadrillion synapses in our brain. So just to give you a reference,
Wow.
100 billion is about the amount of stars we have in the Milky Way.
Mm.
And so we're about 1,000 times more synapses than that in one human brain. And
Wow.
so you're already seeing the structural complexity on that. And then now you add the temporal complexity, time scales. And we'll talk about like alpha, we can talk later about alpha rhythms, beta rhythms, all these things, about how information is encoded. And now you start to kind of be like, wow, okay, I can see how the information structuring can get very complex and allow for what we call plasticity. You can change it
Mm.
too dynamically, not just how they're connected, but how they fire with each other.
Mm.
Not to get too far into the weeds, but that's kind of, I wanted to provide a sort of cellular basis of what we're talking about here. So we have neurons, glia, synapses, and they all kind of comprise the sort of cellular architecture of the brain, if you will.
Yeah, and you talked about the time element. So when you
Mhm.
say, how does that work?
So
Can you talk to that?
yeah, absolutely. So one of the classic things that we learn in neuroscience school is something called Hebbian theory,
Mhm.
and that's that neurons that fire together wire together, and
Mm.
that's the idea of plasticity. And what that means is that there are certain cell populations in our brain, and this is something that's still under research. We don't really know why, that are constantly active. What does that
Mm.
mean? They're active. They are firing electrical signals. So our brains, another important thing to mention is that these neurons, the way they communicate with each other is through electrical impulses, which is amazing.
Mm.
I mean, what other kinds of, what kind of other tissues do that? I mean, we have adipose tissue, fat cells, muscle cells, these kinds of things. They serve mechanical purposes, but we literally have, things like electrical wires in our brains. And that's an amazing thing as to how how does the brain not short circuit itself? These are all questions that are up to debate, because there's electrical impulses that are conducted in a water system. So that goes into a sort of different sort of conversation. But so what I mean by uh, neurons talking to each other in a time-wise fashion is that different cells. So there's certain cell populations which are constantly firing at their own rhythm, maybe at a random pace. I don't really know how to fire. But then we receive certain sensory inputs. So, for example, we may see something, we may hear something. These gates of information that then that are allowed into the body, and so the senses. Basically, when we get different sensory input, they're transformed, or they're translated into electrical impulses in our brain, and then the connection that impulse makes with another impulse in the brain, if it's firing at the same frequency, they'll interact. Which is really, really fascinating, because it's basically how things like radios work. So in order for you to receive a radio message, you need to be tuned into the same frequency. If you're not tuned into that same frequency, you're not going to receive that message. And actually, there's various types of research on electricity and magnetism that kind of corroborate this phenomenon, including magnetic resonance imaging and, like I said, radios. And the idea of frequency has really been capturing my interest lately, because we talk about in spirituality and stuff like that, like vibrational frequencies. And initially I was like, I didn't really pay much attention to it, but it seems like it may actually play a really large role. So anyways, when two neurons fire at the same frequency, they form connections. And somehow they're able to talk to each other. They form they branch out, and there's protein synthesis that happens, that then they express more receptors at that site. So the next time that sense is activated, it takes much less input for the same stimulation to happen. So you're able to recognize something faster before. These may also lead into dream states, because those circuits now can be activated even without the presence of a stimulus. And over time, if that pathway is not recruited, if it's not reinforced, it actually goes away. That's called long-term depression. A lot of people talk about long-term potentiation. So potentiation is the formation of those connections, but you can also lose those connections. Okay. So we have an adaptive system that allows for that. Another very peculiar question is, okay, so then what happens when you have a lack of stimulus? How are we able to form thoughts and create information? This makes sense when we have sensory motor innervation, but what if we don't have that? And honestly, that's a question up for debate. We don't know. We have things called default mode networks, where things that, like I said, that's just a sort of fancy name for saying there's these networks activated, but we don't know why. And
what about memory? So you said, those connections can disappear over time, but what about memory? Like an impression that I have, like when I was a kid, I can still recreate it in my mind and recreate that experience.
Absolutely.
So what happens to that?
So that's a great question. And so what I described was the fundamental way that we make memories. Now, why we remember certain things and why certain connections might persist versus others, that's also an impossible question to ask. Why are some connections strengthened and seem to persist? Or why is it that I can remember something tomorrow, but I can't remember it in 10 years? All of a sudden, they'll come back to me, in 3 years. That's a very peculiar question. And honestly, I don't I'm trying to remember something right now. I can't remember it. And then when I'm about to go to sleep 8 hours later, all of a sudden come back to me. Why does that happen? We don't know. But the thing is that there seems to be a physical substrate in which it's stored. That's for sure. And the reason for that's the fundamental basis of neuroscience research, because when you remove that substrate, so for example, when we remove a part of the brain region, for example, the hippocampus, or we perturb that system through like deep brain stimulation, or we can enhance it through like transmit magnetic stimulation, TMS, we can either lower the memory or we can recapitulate it. There's been some really fundamental work in animal models that's been done actually in our lifetimes. People like in New York University, it's absolutely amazing. They're able to map out spatial memory in mice. They were literally able to resolve the specific neurons that were responsible for a mouse turning left to right, going up, down, those kinds of things. And the cool thing was, if you stimulate those neurons, you would make the mouse turn right. It would look right like that. So you're able to recapitulate, those memories. So it's like, and they're able to take it away. So these are the kind of experiments that we do in lab. So things like, you have a question, and then you intervene it. You try to mess with it, and then you try to put it back and see if you can regain that function. And basically different ways of proving that this is that. But memory is a fascinating. That is literally the core interest of my research, and we're trying to figure out what are the substrates of it, because it plays a fundamental role in so many things. Many people don't see, like, for example, addiction is also a form of memory. It's a negative form of memory, PTSD, prolonged depression, and anything can be argued as a form of memory. But the context in which we study it is will kind of govern how we define it per se.
Great. So that is a lot of cutting edge information there. So kind of just to take away a few points. One is the synapses that you described, the connections between neurons at a certain frequency, and we use this very loosely in our colloquial language, right? My frequency matched with that person's frequency, so we connected. I mean, it almost sounds like that's unintentional, but there is some truth to frequencies, and who knows, maybe there is I don't know if this is too much woo woo, but is it possible to even connect synapses across bodies, or is it only within the brain? I don't know.
If you ask me, I 100% believe you can. We can talk about that in a separate time outside of the podcast, but theoretically it's possible. Because you can imagine this. Let's just do a quick thought experiment where, if you were to, like I said, if we take the same principle like a radio, which is a synthetic object, and you have two radios that are made of the exact same physical construct and they vibrate at the same frequency, you have a passage of information. We know we have that because that's what we're using right now. It's the way that we're communicating right now. So you can imagine then, if you have two twins, clones of the same exact neural architecture that are firing in the exact same way, there will be a passage of information across the two systems. Now, the complexity of our brains and our biology, the probability of that happening is extremely low. But you can imagine a phenomenon where that happens. Or maybe I have one chip in my brain and you have a chip in your brain that we can then vibrate at a certain frequency. We already do that with like phones, right? Like we can put one in our ear and we can talk to each other. But why not in our brains? We don't have to actually physically move our mouth. We can just think about something and boom, it's coming to you.
Yeah. So, want to bring a slightly the idea of love. So do you think, and I don't know how neuroscience looks at love. Is love something to do with something, a connection of that kind? Because in poetry, it's often described as some kind of a connection between two human beings or two beings. It could be even with your dog or your cat. But there's a certain connection that you create. What does neuroscience think of that?
Sure. So I think the way that raw neuroscience would approach it. So here's one thing I guess I want to kind of define before I explore this topic or any topics moving forward, is that I'll answer certain questions from the neuroscientist approach, which is actually quite reductionist, because in a way, like, it takes, what does a neuroscience say about it? And then, like, what does the sort of human in me say about it? Because it's could be slightly different. So I think love is obviously a very complex and it's a beautiful experiential thing that I think is virtually impossible to actually define, because it's an experience, right? It's like, how do you define the color green or something like that? But I think that from the sort of neuroscience aspect, there's been a lot of good work to suggest the sort of play of neurotransmitters and their play in certain brain regions, and how they inform experiences like pleasure and reward and these kinds of things. So what am I referring to here? Neurotransmitters, like I said, you have these two neurons, they're talking to each other. One way I mentioned was electricity. The other thing that I didn't mention, there's two parts to it, is there's actually substances that are being sent from one neuron to another, like packets of molecules. So it's an interplay of electricity and molecules. Those are the two ways that they talk to each other. And so those are the packets that are then sent from one to another are called neurotransmitters. So the information that's transmitted from one neuron to another, hence neurotransmitters. And so things that are involved in this idea called love, if you were to take, again, a reductionist approach to it, you can think of things like hedonic responses, like what brings me pleasure? What do I find rewarding? What do I find joyful? These are all synonyms that we can use. And some neurotransmitters that come to mind are things like dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins or endogenous opioids, endocannabinoids that have been a hot topic lately. And so these are some of the sort of the things that seem to modulate these kinds of experiences. And how are these? So these are studied in the lab using animal models. Again, we're able to dissect some of these mechanisms where we try to characterize animal behavior. It's actually a huge area of research for a lot of people, where, for example, they'll put a mouse or a rat in a context with a lot of stimulus, like, things to play with and other mice to interact with. And you can clearly see, like, they're more interactive, they're more curious, they're, these are things that we have to define. Whereas if you put them in isolation, they're sleeping a lot. They don't want to eat too much. Very similar to what we consider depression in humans, right? And then we go and study that. Then we unfortunately have to sacrifice them, and we go and study, like, what do we see in the brain here? And that's when we get to things like, okay, there may be lower levels of dopamine in the prefrontal cortex, or reduced oxytocin release from the pituitary gland, and these kinds of things, right? That's very specific questions, but that's the kind of information that we can get from that.
Maybe that makes a lot of sense. But maybe we may have to rewind a little bit. And you talked about a few things like prefrontal cortex. You talked about hippocampus. So for a lot of us who are listening to this, who may not actually know what they are, maybe if you can talk a little bit about what are the main parts of the brain, and from what we know today, and what do they actually do?
Sorry, before I kind of forgot. I'm not sure if I really answered your question probably previously, but my take on love is that I think it's definitely a real experience. It's just these neurotransmitters and the brain system that we have is just the sort of physical substrate that allows us to experience that. I think those are two different things, but it's not that. I don't think that love is dopamine. I think that it is just the means by which it can, it can happen or be experienced for us. So, I mentioned some brain regions and circuits and things like that. And so, so the brain is kind of, I guess you say brain vocabulary in referring to, it can be referred to in two broad ways. One is like through anatomical references, and one is through functional references. So anatomically, what I mean is you can say it by lobes, like frontal lobe or parietal lobe or occipital lobe. There's 5 main brain lobes. So it's basically anatomical. And the front is called frontal lobe. And then you have the parietal lobe, these are all Latin derivatives. And you have the occipital lobe. And then you have the temporal lobe. Well, those are 4 brain lobes. Sorry. And then also you can have functional connections. So this is that's what I described then, was like, we're kind of moving away from the anatomical definitions, because we realize that function does not just limit to one region, rather through circuits. And so then you have something kind of like the limbic system, or the nigrostriatal tract, or the corticospinal tract. Sometimes the cortex of the spine, or from the substantia nigra to the striatum, so the nigrostriatal tract, and things like that. And obviously, like we all know that like, you know, if you take out any chunk of the brain, people are going to be affected. So it's not just like one part of the brain does this kind of thing. It's all a very interconnected network. It's something to remember, that although I'll be saying that, you know, this brain region does this cell type does that, it's all connected, and it's all important. So,
so if we were to kind of, from what I have read a little bit, and maybe you can elaborate on that,
sure.
just from a functional organization of what we know today, you talk about the limbic system, which is to do with predominantly memory and emotions, and then there is the stem, which is to, and amygdala, which is the other important. You keep hearing
Yeah.
about it in
Yeah.
your mainstream articles, that it's your fight and flight survival. Helps you with survival, and the third is the prefrontal cortex, which allows you to imagine and organize, which is really the most recent development in human evolution.
Yes.
So if you can
Yes.
throw some little bit light and connect the dots from when we lead a 12-hour day, how much of it are we using each of those, right? At least in modern life. Just maybe if you can connect the dots there, it'll help our audience kind of understand this a little bit better.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think you touched upon a really good point. You touched on all really good points, but one thing you mentioned in the middle there was the sort of evolutionary organization. I think that's a good way to kind of introduce this topic. So what you refer to as a limbic system, let me start there, because that is a very heavily discussed topic, and I think it has risen to popularity for good reason, because of its involvement in our emotional response. And you know, so a lot of the crises, the mental health crises we're having now, can be sort of contextualized in like, how do we deal with our emotions, and how do we, you know, guide those kinds of things. You mentioned some structures like the amygdala. So the limbic system is composed primarily of three structures. There's a sort of connection between the hypothalamus. Hypo means it's under the thalamus, and I'll go into what the thalamus does, which is a very important brain region as well. So the hypothalamus, you have the amygdala. Amygdala actually means almond in Latin. So it's an almond-shaped region of the brain. And these are all also bilateral. So you have two structures on both hemispheres. You have two hemispheres of the brain. And all these structures I'm referring to, you have two sides. And the reason I'm referring to that is that there's only one structure that we think is only unilateral. It's in the very center, and it's called the pineal gland. And again, this is an aside here, but it's the pineal gland has been involved. Like, people think like it's supposed to be the third eye, or that like that they put the fluoride they put in our water is calcifying the pineal gland, which I personally think is some BS there. But you know, it's because that I think a lot of this derived from the fact that we only have one pineal gland. I mean, not really, you know, much other else. Anyways, jumping back into the other limbic system, limbic structure, which is the hippocampus, which is the nidus for memory, like I had sort of briefly mentioned before. So again, rehashing, it's the hypothalamus, amygdala, hippocampus. And so basically, you know, sort of what we think in an evolutionary way is that a lot of the brain regions that are, or circuits that are involved for core survival, seem to be packed more in the center of our brain, like the inside. They're very protected. So like the limbic system, the insular cortex, and I'm just throwing out terms. It doesn't really matter if you know them, but my point is I'm listing structures that are in the brainstem even. The brainstem, limbic system, the insula, these are structures that heavily control our emotions, our core survival, our breathing, heart rate, vascular response. These kinds of things are in the center. And as you mentioned before, is that the cortex seems to be a little bit later in evolution. And that's why it's often referred to as the neocortex. It's actually the very top. The neocortex is actually the top, but, you know, so that the cortical regions seem to evolve later, because that is responsible for a lot of our what makes us human, like our executive functions, our ability to make decisions, our ability to rationalize, things like that are more in the cortical regions in the top. Whereas like, if like the flight or fight response is the pituitary, right? It's a very central region. Um, and so we touched on the limbic system, touched on the thalamus, which is slightly above. So, okay, so let's just talk about it again. Like, I'm kind of jumping between functional and anatomical terms here, but you also mentioned the brain stem, which is literally a stem. Like you can think of like a stalk. So I'll just kind of briefly describe it. You have like the stem, which is where like your neck is, and it kind of pokes through a hole called the foramen magnum, and so the brainstem, pokes through up there, and that connects to the core structures like your limbic system and all that, and then sprouts up into the cortex. So you can kind of imagine this is the kind of model that we're working with the brain. And so the brainstem is also involved in our vascular response and our breathing and our controlling our heart rate and stuff like that. And also our sleep-wake cycles, digestion, coughing. Our vomiting center is also in our brainstem. And so why it's organized that way, you got to ask the man above, but that's where it is.
Or the woman.
Yeah, or the woman. Yeah, exactly. And so like you go a little bit further up, and that's when you have the sort of emotions and whatnot in the limbic system, and then that relays information to your senses, and that kind of feeds all back into it, right? So like, then the cortex then receives information from the outside, brings it back inside, and then we process it from the inside, like the central structure, and then we redirect our senses to see what we want. That's the kind of idea that we think is happening. Yeah.
That's that's quite technical.
Sorry,
so
I don't know.
Let's
break it down even more. Okay.
No, that's fine. No, you're doing great. You're doing great. You're a neuroscientist, so but let me do the interpretation here. So what I'm taking away from what you're saying is that if you were to just look at the brain from an evolutionary perspective, there is a part of us that shares behavior and motivation to a reptile, and we call it a reptilian brain in a sense, right? Or the less evolved of the species in this planet, which are driven by fight or flight or procreation, and in our more moral code, we talk about them as more lower level ways of living, emotion, jealousy, hatred, just obsession with sex, things like that, which are survival oriented part of the brain. And then there is the part of the brain that's evolved more recently, which you kind of called it as neocortex, and there are a whole bunch of functions it has, which has to be a conscious effort on our part to use in a way, because by default, you and I are going to be motivated by our reptilian brain. We're going to be excited with procreation. We're going to be excited with survival, eat well, drink well, sleep well, all survival related, default. But if you want to explore higher levels of your own humanity, then you need to go into those other aspects of the brain, which takes a little bit of effort. So just kind of contextualizing the technical information that you shared to how it impacts us in our choices in daily life.
Yep, that's absolutely correct. And this is all, like I said, these are all models of what we don't have a unified model of the brain. We're all just making this as we go. Honestly, like neuroscience has blown up so fast in the recent years. I remember when I was even studying in 2010 that it's like neuroscience, like, why are you studying that? My parents were like, you're not going to get a job. That's great. Okay. So like, I mean, it's we really don't understand a lot of things, and we're just making different models of it. And so, I mean, it'll probably change in the next, you talk to me again another 10 years and I'll be like, okay, I think we've entirely discarded our previous, when we realized actually there's something else completely above this.
Yeah.
No.
Well, so maybe let's spend some time around brain health. And that's an area that you're working on. And look, I think that's an area that is a mainstream concern and an opportunity. A healthy brain means you're a higher performing individual in a society today which is not necessarily based on physical labor. Your success depends on your ability to utilize your brain faculties better than the others. And the other thing is the this downside of it is the disease aspect of it. The mental health aspect of it, or things like age related dementia, Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, those kind of other things. So what's your take, and what are you seeing in that space of brain health? How does an average person maintain brain health?
This is I would say it's a tough question to answer in a little while. And it's so dependent on everybody's context,
Hmm.
and what they might need for their own well-being. Certain people are really good at certain things. Other people are not so good at other things. But I'm going to provide you with a general tips
Yeah.
that you've kind of heard of. But more important, I'll tell you why. And I'll give you
Mhm.
rationale for them. Because there's some things that are said and they just ask you to take your word for it. And there's some things that have a lot of evidence. So I'll tell you what
Hmm.
some certain things that have evidence for, which I think that really helps me stay committed to doing these kinds of things.
Hmm.
So diet and exercise is what I'll start with.
Hmm.
Ultra important. And this is one of those things that there has been ample evidence. I know I said that I was going to provide ample evidence, but I haven't gone through the literature extensively, but I've heard so much about it. I mean, it just makes sense. I'm just going to start off by saying I advocate good diet and good exercise for everybody. So in terms of diet, now we're realizing that diabetes, for example, seems to be a core component of almost everything that we're seeing,
Hmm.
including neurodegenerative diseases. Now seems to be a metabolic dysfunction. Previously, we thought it was
Wow.
something with like plaques and tangles and stuff, which they are implicated, but insulin receptor signaling seems to be very much uh, dysfunctional, and it's that,
Hmm.
and our neurons are not able to use glucose and the energy they receive in Alzheimer's, and not just Alzheimer's, but in almost in Parkinson's and Lewy body dementias, and so all kinds of other different neurodegenerative. So diabetes is a big issue. Too much blood sugar will also stiffen your vessels, which leads to hypertension. Hypertension is also not great because it puts a lot of stress on the heart, which is a pump. If the heart has to pump more, it has to take more force to pump the blood into your vessels, that's going to cause a heart enlargement and heart failure. And so that's not good either. Um, we all know about the implications of high fat diets,
Hmm.
LDL, HDL triglycerides. These are basically things that are sticky components. They're, when you work with butter or oils and stuff, you can see how viscous they are. You can see, you leave ghee out on the stove for too long, you can see how it kind of aggregates and clumps together. And that's exactly what it
Hmm.
does in our bodies. Obviously, a reasonable amount. You should definitely
Hmm.
not stop eating fats, healthy fats. Healthy fats are very important. Um, Things like avocado oil, again, like not normal amounts of ghee are definitely important to your intestinal lining and your things like that to maintain. But what I'm talking about is, I would say fast food twice a week is on the borderline of too much. Three times is too much. And I think
Hmm.
people underestimate that, especially like college going kids and stuff like that. They're like, whatever, like it is what it is. But we're seeing atherosclerosis developing in the early 20s now. The rate of heart
Hmm.
disease has been in the steady incline for young men. So diet is actually diet. So I'm not going to start going on my rant about diet and exercise. I think everyone knows about it. Um,
No, I don't think so. I don't
okay,
think
no, okay,
I don't think people correlate diet and exercise with brain health. I mean,
okay, yeah,
right?
yeah.
People have enough awareness now about physical health,
Hmm.
but what you're saying is very important, right? The correlation between an active lifestyle and brain health
Hmm.
is something that people don't automatically think of.
Yep, and yeah, so I mean, I'll kind of expand a little bit on that if that's the direction we want to go with this. I mean, it is,
Yes,
and
go ahead.
people talk about again like coronary heart disease, right? Like vessels, and I think there's been a good emphasis on that. But people also don't realize that the brain is the most metabolic structure in our entire body by far. The amount of energy our brain uses compared to any organ is way higher. where do you think it gets its resources from? From the blood supply.
Mm.
And so there's a heavy vasculature to the brain, and those can 100% get clogged, and they can 100% get can undergo the stiffening that we're talking about due to high blood glucose. Another point, I guess we'll segue into what I want to talk about with stress, because I think that that's also kind of uh, not, I wouldn't say poorly understood, but people always say, like, don't stress yourself out. What does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
And so stress is nothing but a summary of the flight or fight response, which we have evolved to from this need to quickly adapt to stressful situations. So if we're getting chased by an animal, or if we're under actual threat, how does our body respond to such situations? Because that's very different than when we're just sitting and relaxing in our dens or caves or on our couch. And so very quickly, what's happening is that you're perceiving in the flight or fight response, you're perceiving certain events that you find fearful. So either through your sight or hearing or something like that. Your brain processes this information, again, through the previous connections that we've made. And then the hypothalamus comes up. The hypothalamus, it gets activated. It gets triggered, talks to your pituitary. Again, these are all sort of that central component of the brain that we're talking about here. And your pituitary is going to signal your adrenal glands. Your adrenal glands are actually not in your brain. So again, impact of the peripheral nervous system. People forget about what the nervous system does in the rest of your body. So hypothalamus talks pituitary signals to the adrenal glands to reduce. That's when you get your cortisol release and your adrenaline. So that actually comes from your adrenal glands. And so, I think we've all heard of adrenaline. What does adrenaline do? It dilates your pupils, it constricts your vessels, it increases your heart rate. Well, what does it also do? It causes increased fatty acid synthesis. It causes increased glycogenolysis. That means it breaks down glycogen from your liver, turns it into glucose for your body to use. Because if you're fleeing from an animal, you need those extra energy resources to make that happen. And of course, like both adrenaline and cortisol do that as well. The unfortunate part is that we experience flight or fight on a daily basis from things like listening to your boss or your peers, or when you're working for an assignment, on a daily basis. And the worst part is that we don't have any outlet for them. Yeah. And so it's this compounded effect that we're not supposed to actually sort of experience these things that often, but two, we're just sitting on a couch or in front of a desk and experiencing these things. So obviously they're going to have maladaptive responses. That kind of feeds back into the fact that into the idea of glucose and hypertension. And these are the nidus for so many issues people don't understand. That vascular dementia, the issues with blood vessels, is one of the biggest reasons. It's probably one of the most common reasons for dementia, right? Because even like the most, we have such fine vessels in our brain that if they lose the blood flow to the regions that they're going to because they're too stiff or they have a little bit too much clogging the arteries, they have compromised the vasculature. That's very bad for your brain regions. And unfortunately, the brain, because it's so metabolically active, it absolutely cannot afford that kind of a deficit. With your muscles, every now and then, okay, you lose some, you can atrophy. It'll reduce its size to compensate. Your brain can't do that. Your brain, after a certain point, cannot reproduce any neurons. It's a very important point that people don't understand. Whereas your muscles and stuff, you can have hypertrophy, which means you produce more the cells can enlarge. You can have hyperplasia, where the cells increase in number. The brain is not like that. We can increase and decrease the number of synapses, but if you lose an actual core neuron, it's gone. Especially in our central nervous system. Peripheral nervous system, there's whatever.
So in other words, what you're saying is that leading a physically active and eating healthy has an indirect impact to your brain health, including risk of dementia and things like that.
Absolutely.
Right. And so you also talked about neurons dying. Now, how do neurons die? I mean, is it because of blood supply, or what happens? How does it happen?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And again, this is a research topic that's underway because it can happen by many mechanisms. If any cell in our body loses blood supply, oxygen, nutrients, it will undergo a process called necrosis, which is a pathology. You don't want that to happen. And basically, this is, it's a complex series of biochemical steps that results in certain enzymes being released that basically dissolves the cell. And in our brain, actually, because of the high fat content, it actually will create this sort of like kind of like pus-like structure when it kind of melts. And that's called liquefactive necrosis. It literally liquefies due to sort of necrosis. There are other sort of processes where there's targeted removal of certain synapses. That's called apoptosis. So we just call it apoptosis and necrosis. Because like I said, you want to be able to remove the synapses that are not necessary. That's a sort of healthy process. We actually our brains go heavy apoptosis during like adolescence. We actually start to lose a heavy amount of neurons there. That allows us to actually kind of refine that prefrontal cortex, like I said, that frontal area, that new part of our brain, which is responsible for executive decisions. There's a reason why the drinking age is at 21, because the prefrontal cortex finishes developing around that time. The apoptosis finishes. And so, you have the connections that are there are deemed to be strong enough to survive and whatnot. And so that's kind of the process with it. And glia play a very important role in this, mind you. They are they clean up the synapses. They're the ones that engulf the protein parts, and they recycle the subcomponents to then allow them to use them again, or they can aggregate. That also has been the sort of, in certain people, it seems to be a little dysfunctional. We don't know why they don't get recycled. They kind of aggregate and lead to deposits. So those are the kinds of things that we're trying to study and figure out how to lead it into more of a healthy process instead of a disease process.
Great. So I think the other takeaway, I think, is stress, right? And
yes,
coming back
diet,
to
exercise, stress.
Coming back to neuron degeneration, also has to do with stress and how do you manage stress. I mean, you can read a book about it. There's a lot of content, but essentially, managing your environment, being conscious about what's stimulating you, getting into that automatic fight or flight mode. Are you in that mode or not? That's up to you to figure out. And I think that's a great pivot into the more metaphysical side of it. And I think I want to take a pause here, wrap this up, and maybe start a new chapter on that, Shri, because I think that would be another 30-40 minute conversation, and we can logically end the physiological aspect of neuroscience and then pivot into the metaphysical side as a next step. So I want to thank you for walking us through with in great detail a lot of the technicalities. I guess we will obviously walk away with the core summary of what you said, because you did share a lot more than what our brains are trained to consume.
I'm sorry about that. I think I may have gotten a little too technical, but and you guys can always replay this and listen to it and talk to me at any time. I can share my contact information with you and have a casual conversation. But I wanted to provide a little bit of a different context that you may or may not read in Google per se, because everybody knows some of these things, but providing a little more technical light on some of these things, I think, I appreciate that when someone does that. So I thought, I share that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to take a break and then come back and pick up this conversation and take it into a slightly different domain.